If you're anything like me, you probably like to think of yourself as a rational person. You don't believe things just because someone told you to believe them. You seek out evidence for yourself, you do your research, you find the facts, and then you make up your own mind. You're a free thinker. Other people, on the other hand, don't think for themselves. They hold beliefs handed down to them from their parents, given to them in church, taught to them in school. They believe what it's convenient for them to believe. And arguing with other people can be frustrating. No matter how clever or quick-witted you are, and no matter how much evidence you think you have on your side, they're slow to admit defeat, and they'll often retain beliefs that to you seem to be completely irrational and belied by the evidence in front of you. In short, changing minds seems to be impossible. And here's the problem. This sounds deliberately provocative, and it's certainly controversial, but I think if you watch the rest of this video, you'll probably agree. Nobody is rational. Most of our thoughts and beliefs, most of the time, aren't a product of the facts and evidence in front of us, but are mostly based on things we already believed and things we're predisposed to believe. In this video, I want to spend time walking through some of the reasons why this is the case, regardless of who we are. I'm going to draw on a bunch of academic research from a variety of fields, a reference list in the down there bit, as well as some of my own work and experience in this area, because my PhD thesis is about expertise and authority. I want to explore the idea of rational argumentation and the limits it has in changing people's minds. And perhaps we'll have some constructive ideas by the end about how to change the discussions which change people's beliefs. Before we go in, I think it's important to consider what we mean by rationality. The common use of the term rationality tends to refer to removing emotions from how we make decisions and allowing ourselves to be guided only by the facts and evidence in front of us, combined with the logical machinery and critical thinking skills we've developed in our brain minds. But if you consider it for a moment, you'll realise that none of the above tells you what those decisions are for. I could be rationally considering the best way to acquire pizza whilst not leaving my bed, the easiest way to take a shit on the floor and make everyone think it was someone else, or just how to make sure I finish an essay on time whilst not losing my mind from boredom. All of those are goals that can be considered rationally, but all of them are driven by quite conflicting values. Rationality, then, is just doing whatever is most consistent with your values, and two people can have values that are entirely at odds with one another. Look, if I'm diagnosed with a terminal illness and I want to prioritise having as long a life as possible over the quality of that life, I'm likely to take whatever treatment options I can get, no matter how invasive and painful. If, on the other hand, I just want to enjoy the time I have left and I don't like spending time in hospitals, then it's rational for me to want to avoid chemotherapy or open heart surgery or ending up on a ventilator. With that in mind, we can dive into the limits of rational argumentation. All of us hold in our minds a whole set of beliefs about the world. We attach names to objects and meanings to concepts, and those are arbitrary. We believe in things like gods or ghosts or the void, and if these things are all interconnected, like nodes in a network, we can call this the web of belief, although some philosophers also like to call it the Hesse net, named after Mary Hesse. Some of these beliefs are more important and influential on other beliefs than others. My fundamental belief in an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful God has an effect upon how I understand human morality, what comes after death, the meaning of pain and suffering, and what it means to have a good life. My belief that the pizza place is still open affects only my choice of hangover food and perhaps my bowel movements for the next 2 days. We can, sometimes, hold conflicting beliefs in our minds. We call this cognitive dissonance. For example, I could believe in two axioms. The grass isn't always greener on the other side of the fence, but also that grapes are sourest when they are in easy reach. That is, we both tend to want what we already have, but also we tend to want what we don't have. In order for me to continue living normally, I either need to put this out of my mind, ignore it, or resolve the dissonance between those two beliefs. If I try to introduce a fundamental belief to someone that conflicts with their prior beliefs, what's already in their web, then the likelihood is that they reject it. Why? Because to accept it would mean a whole lot of work, rearranging their pre-existing beliefs around this new thing. For example, if I want to convince you that the Earth is flat, then in order for you to believe that, you'll also need to believe that everyone who told you that the Earth is round is either wrong or lying, and there's some reason for that. You'll need to reconsider how satellites work and the structure of the solar system that you learned in school. You'll probably have to completely change your understanding of space and time, and maybe even the meaning of your life to fit around this new, fundamental shift in your web of belief. That's a lot of work. Most of the time, then, we reject significant new facts or ideas if they're hard to fit into our web of belief. and we accept them if they largely reinforce or fit with what we already have. It's hard to convince people of something that conflicts with their pre-existing values because those values would have to be shifted around to make room for the new information. So we've established that people's background beliefs, what they already think about the world, are really influential on how they consider new information. Let's go deeper. One of the most important sets of pre-existing beliefs and values we have is our cultural background. As someone brought up mostly in the United Kingdom, I tend to have a certain set of values. I probably value democracy and liberty in some balance with one another. I probably have at least a superficial commitment to equal rights and liberties for various groups. I probably don't care very much for gun ownership, and so on. These values and my own idea of my cultural identity influence my perception of other things in the world. Cultural cognition refers to how we perceive facts and risk in relation to our pre-existing values. A really good example here is how my political beliefs influence my perception of scientific consensus, whether there is a shared belief amongst the scientific community about particular things. In a 2011 study by a researcher called Dan Kahan, it was found that people who have values that are hierarchical and individualistic, that is, they value the idea that some people should be above others and that people should be responsible for themselves and not others, tend to believe that there is less consensus over the risk of climate change, the efficacy of gun control legislation, and the risk associated with the disposal of nuclear waste. In contrast, people with egalitarian and communitarian values, that is, they care about equality of people and believe that people should be responsible for one another, believe that these issues are all settled science. So the cultural cognition thesis tells us that people tend to be psychologically disposed to believe that the behaviour they find honourable is socially beneficial, and the behaviour they find distasteful or base is socially detrimental. Our perception of whether particular policies are risky or likely to be effective is strongly influenced by the values we hold about the world. The facts we choose to believe are a product of our values. All of the above means that in order to change people's minds, often you first need to change their values, and the values that we hold or ought to hold are often up for debate. People can be changed from individualists to collectivists, from liberals to leftists or reactionaries, from MRAs to feminists. But in order to get them to go from one to another, you can't rely solely on rational argumentation. Why? Because when we're engaged in arguments, we're usually using what's known as motivated reasoning. Let's say I'm doing a competitive debate, which I do, a lot. It's my main hobby because I'm a massive nerd, have a crippling need to be validated by winning arguments in highly formalised settings which aren't at all applicable to the real world of argumentation. I'm told I have to support the motion, this house would ban zoos. I immediately start to come up with arguments as to why we ought to ban zoos. Animals have sentience, if not consciousness, and can experience both pleasure and suffering. There is no principal distinction between their capacity for suffering and our own. We shouldn't keep animals in cages because we wouldn't keep humans in cages, and they are comparable, even if there are external benefits to animals to be gained by doing so. I might come up with some arguments for the opposing side, but mainly with a view to figuring out how to respond to them. In the debate itself, people will come up with reasons that I'm wrong, and my immediate thought will be how I can show that they're mistaken. I'm not evaluating their arguments on their merits. All of my reasoning is devoted to showing that I am right and they are wrong. Now, this is one pretty extreme example of motivated reasoning, but you probably recognise the situation. When you get into an argument, you want to win it. It doesn't matter if the other person is making sense, you can only think of how to prove that they are wrong. The arguments we find persuasive, in other words, just like the evidence that we tend to accept, are influenced by our values. The best predictor, for example, of whether someone thinks the electoral college system in the US presidential elections is a good system is whether they are a Republican or a Democrat. If they are a Republican, they tend to think it's a good system and value highly the argument that it's a way of preventing populous states like California from holding too much power over smaller states. Conversely, if you are a Democrat, you are more likely to believe that it's a bad system, which unfairly allows rural voters to have a disproportionate amount of power. There's no way to judge between those arguments that isn't dependent on the value system you already hold, and which argument you believe is pretty much dictated by what kind of outcome you want, rather than the quality of the argument itself. So, changing someone's mind likely involves changing their values, rather than just presenting them with the right evidence or the right argument. At this point, you might well think, we should just give up on ever convincing anyone of anything, because everyone reasons in ways that are fundamentally motivated by what's good for them and theirs. And to an extent, that's true. You need to change people's circumstances and alter what's good for them in order to change their values, and that in turn changes the evidence and argument they believe. Find a way to carbon taxes to benefit corporations, and suddenly, magically, there'll be a whole lot more environmentally conscious CEOs. But there's more to changing minds than just that, and it can be done. And I want to go through some thoughts on what I'm calling selective vulnerability to illustrate the circumstances under which minds can be changed. All the material I've given you so far is well established through social scientific evidence, but now I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit, and I really want you to stay with me. This is still based both off my own research and also loosely off of research in the philosophy of science by Thomas Kuhn and Lakatos, which talks about paradigms and research programs as ways in which thought and belief are structured. Whether or not we're open to having our minds changed about something depends heavily on the context in which we're discussing it. If you get stopped in the street by some Mormons, as has happened to every student in the University of Edinburgh approximately 1 bajillion times, then it's unlikely that if you try to debate them about their religion, that you're going to change their minds. In part, that's because they're missionaries whose entire motivation at that point in time is to convert other people to their faith. But it's also because the context you're encountering them in is one where they are not open to the possibility that their beliefs have the potential to change. The same goes for Jehovah's Witnesses when they knock on your door, or edgelords commenting, Nazis were left-wing and the Holocaust didn't happen, but if it did, it would have been good, actually, in the comments section of YouTube videos. Sometimes, though, even the most fundamental beliefs can be changed. At the start of my life, the vast majority of my family on my dad's side were Jehovah's Witnesses. It's religion which has almost total control over most aspects of your life. Your family, your friends, your community, your work are often built around it. That makes leaving really difficult, almost impossible for most people most of the time. But today, many years later, most of them are no longer in the religion. And that didn't happen because of a one-off event, or because they read The God Delusion and just found Dawkins' polemical style and wit utterly compelling. It happened because, over a long period of time, small parts of their web of belief were chipped away or undermined, leaving them with cognitive dissonance too difficult to resolve. Lakatos calls these beliefs the protective belt, which can be removed over time without the core of a belief set being challenged, but eventually rendering that belief set core vulnerable to challenges. It also happened because they felt like they had less and less to lose by leaving. The religion started to treat them badly, and their kids grew up, and less of their social life was dependent on the religion. Eventually, they were left in positions where individual events were enough to tip them over the edge. For one of them, at least, it was watching the Australian Royal Commission into the mishandling of child abuse allegations by the Jehovah's Witness leadership that made them feel like enough was enough, and they could no longer remain in the religion. There are critical points when there's enough dissonance and discontent that there's the possibility that individual discussions and events might result in change. But even then, that change is unlikely to come over the course of one argument. In the context of a debate or an argument, people tend to want to win, or at least to not lose. It's only afterwards, in periods of self-reflection, that people start to change their minds. And what we can learn from this is that there are many contexts in which engaging in arguments just isn't worth it. Many of the arguments you have online, for example, are fruitless back and forths in which nobody's mind is genuinely up for changing. The only hope you have is that someone looking on silently might be in a position where they haven't yet made up their mind, and that you look more persuasive than the person on the other side. But banking on that might be a worse use of your time and energy than, making or disseminating content that engages people on terms that are more favourable to you, rather than engaging in public arguments. Don't be drawn into arguments or debates that nobody has an interest in making productive. To move to something a little more specific, I want to talk about an idea that I call cognitive halters. Something like this is also known as a thought-terminating cliché, where commonly used phrases are used to resolve cognitive dissonance. For example, in 1984, "we have always been at war with Eurasia," or "we have always been at war with East Asia," are used as contradictory but thought-terminating clichés to resolve the problems of cognitive dissonance caused by the constantly switching enemies and allegiances of the moment. But what I'm thinking of here is slightly different. It's less about using a particular phrase to resolve dissonance, and more about how individual words and phrases can cause us to shut down thought. In conversation with someone who might consider themselves an anti-SJW or a classical liberal, you might find that they don't respond particularly well to terms like patriarchy or oppression or cisgender or neoliberalism as categories or descriptors of how the world works. You're liable to find yourself, if you use these words, labelled as an SJW or a feminazi. The conversation may well be over. And even if it's not over, it's unlikely that anything you say past this point is going to make a difference, because the arguments you're making are mentally categorised as incorrect. If you make the same argument, but without using the terms that cause that categorisation, then you may well have a greater degree of success. And note that this doesn't just apply to people on the reactionary end of the spectrum. Everyone has terms that cause them to mentally categorize another person as simply incorrect. When someone calls me an SJW, then I start to see them as an unreliable source of information who need not be taken seriously and also just isn't going to have their mind changed by me. It's a well-observed phenomenon across all parts of the political spectrum. So the takeaway here is that it's possible to engage people who completely disagree with you, but you have to be really careful about the terms that you use. Avoid using jargon which is specific to your particular political or cultural background, because it can cause the conversation to end prematurely. If you can, you want to try to engage people using terms and concepts that are familiar to them, but turn toward the argument that you're trying to make. It's not impossible, it's just really, really hard. A lot of the time when we argue, we're not actually trying to convince the person on the other end to change their mind. Debates and arguments are often performative. They're done in front of an audience with the aim of demonstrating our dominance. That's the frame for every single Ben Shapiro destroys video. It's not about changing minds, but showing superiority and humiliating your opponents. It's a way of solidifying your existing beliefs and also of signalling membership of a particular group who have particular beliefs about the world and showing that you are superior to another group who have different beliefs. In order to make our discussions more fruitful, and ideally to sway more people away from reactionary politics and towards progressivism, it's really important to recognise the limits of rational argumentation. Much of the time, debates and argument only result in both sides having their views further entrenched. Humiliating another person in discussion might make you feel good, and it will probably give you a nice screenshot to post on our Chapo Trap House or Late Stage Capitalism on Reddit for plenty of upvotes, but it's unlikely to bring anyone over to your side who was previously in the opposite camp. In order to really engage people and change their minds, we have to try to engage them on their own terms. See what kinds of values they hold and make your facts and evidence and arguments conform to that set of values. Alternatively, you could try to alter their material circumstances so that people have an incentive to alter the values they hold, and belief in the arguments, the evidence will follow from that. But much of the time, you don't have the power or the means to alter those circumstances. So look, altering people's views isn't easy. It's especially difficult to do through rational argumentation. We have to recognise the limits of debate, appeal to people's emotions and their values, and avoid using your own side's jargon. Treat them as people and engage them repeatedly, particularly when they seem like they're genuinely looking for answers rather than just for a fight. And if you're lucky, you might even change their mind. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content or you found it informative or educational, please give it a like, subscribe, tell me that you liked it in the comments down below, maybe even share it somewhere. If you look at any of my other videos, you'll probably notice that every single one of them has a like to dislike ratio of somewhere about 1 in 10. The main reason for that is because of an altercation I had with some people on the alt-right who don't like being called alt-right a few months ago, which resulted in them brigading me fairly repeatedly, and all of the videos on my channel now have been downvoted into oblivion, and a lot of people call me a fascist, so that's nice. Thanks, Sargon. So if you did like this, then I really, really appreciate it if you could let me know, because it really, really helps in terms of motivating me to make more of these. So thanks very much for watching.